In other languages, for instance, the English language, whenever we refer to God, there are very few appellations or references. G-O-D or G-D, Lord Almighty. Those are the only three references. There's God, Almighty, and Lord. Even Lord doesn't necessarily indicate the divine, because we know there's the House of Lords in England. So we have mortals are called lords. So the only two appellations which are references to the omnipotent is God and Almighty. He's Almighty. However, in the Hebrew language, there are multiple references to God. For instance, there's Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which we don't pronounce that name. The pronunciation is as Adni, master, and it's spelled not as master, which means master is Aleph Daled Nun Yud, Adni. Then there's Ko, there's Kale, there's Shakai, there's Elokim, and the many names. As I mentioned, the name of Ramban, that what is the bedrock of the holiness of the Torah? The Torah is the holiest thing in existence. Every letter of the Torah, from the first letter to the last letter, is a letter in one of the names of God. There are 72 letter name of God. There are many names we're not even aware of. But there are multiple, endless names of God, and the Torah itself is only the letters of God's name are conjugated to spell the narrative, which is the Torah. In the beginning, God created, and so on and so forth. But every letter, the narrative, is a letter of one of God's names. So the question is, what do we need? First of all, how do we know that these names exist? If God is infinite, how do you describe something that's infinite? Saying all-powerful. All-powerful is, so to say, an understatement in the word all-powerful. For instance, Talmud tells us that there was a rabbi of the Talmud. He was in the presence of his Rebbe, of his teacher, and he began speaking the praises of God with various appellations. And he kept going and he stopped. So his Rebbe said to him, "Are you finished?" He says, "If you finished, you are not permitted to start. Because if wherever you stop, it means it's this and no more than that. But if God is more than that," and it says, what is it analogous to? A person is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And you say he's worth hundreds of thousands. Although hundreds of thousands is considered substantial wealth, but if you're worth hundreds of millions, it's an insult. You're not depicting that person correctly. So God is infinite, and God has unlimited abilities and characteristics. So if you stop at any point and you don't say the others, that means you're indicating it's this and no more than that. Therefore, you're not permitted even to start praising. The appellations or the praises we have are only because God himself identified himself with these various appellations, with Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Adni, Shakai, Ko, Kale, Elokim. Every one of the ones that we're familiar with, it's God says, I am A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So God says, that's how I am identified. I am Hakel, Hagodl, Hagiba, Vanora, the great, the powerful, the awesome God. I am Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That's how God introduced himself. So if God himself is identifying himself as such, if therefore we refer to him as that, but anything which he doesn't, we have the right, because saying that or identifying him as that, it indicates it's that and no more than that. Therefore, we don't begin. And really, it's based on a pasuk in Tehillim, where David says, "Mi yimalel gvuras Hashem yashmei kol tiloso." Who could utter the power of God to make known all his praise. It's not possible. If that's the case, we don't start. Mi yamalel guras Hashem. Who could utter God's powers? Yashmiya kol tiloso. To make known all his praise. Therefore, we don't begin. So throughout the prayer service, or Tehillim, Psalms, or the Torah itself, we find many of these appellations in the Torah itself. On the Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, we find Adni, Master, Elokim, and in each context, one is used, not another. So you have to understand, firstly, what each of those appellations represent, and why are they used in specific instances and not other instances. And if you understand the context in which they're used, it's communicating something in terms of God's involvement at the particular moment. Is it the attribute of mercy? Is it the attribute of justice? Is it the attribute where God is indiscriminate kindness? Is God demonstrating, although he's almighty, he controls that might and he reigns in on it and he gives it, he only allows it to be applied in a very specific, limited way. And each one of those appellations indicate the moment and what way at that moment he's relating to existence. The Ramchal writes and asks a question. We had studied that one of the 13 tenets of Judaism is God is infinite. There's no beginning, there's no end. He's the first, he's the last. So if he's infinite, so an infinite being, usually a master, whether he's an artist, a goldsmith, whatever he may be, usually what he creates is a reflection of his ability. So if God himself is infinite, why did he create such a finite, exact world? He could have created a world which is unending to give us an inkling of who he is, but he didn't. You only have an inkling of who he is that if you have an understanding of the smallest detail of existence, and as we advance ourselves scientifically, medically, in every sense we advance, we begin appreciating, understanding what we don't even understand. Of course, when we begin scratching the surface, the level of genius is something which is so amazing and overwhelming and not unfathomable genius. And the more we delve, the more we realize the genius is unfathomable. And many things that we say were happenstance, we say, no, there is a specific infrastructure, intent, and therefore it functions that way because it's something which we can't even relate to. But it's not obvious. It's not obvious. God could have created a world which is immense, unending, as the galaxies, which we don't have relevance to that. The world could have been an unlimited world. The human being could be beyond, multiple times beyond what he is. But yet he created this little 6-foot creature with so many organs and so many limbs and an intellect which has a limited, as great as the genius may be, it's still within limitations. He could have created an intellectual being who was able to fathom every human being walking the face of the earth could have been Solomon and beyond, but yet no, everything's within limit. What's the concept of that? So the Ramchal writes, when God created this world, he did not create the world to show his capability or his capacity. That's not why he created this world. And there's a basic fundamental. He created this world so the human being should be a beneficiary, the ultimate beneficiary, to have a relationship with him. And based on his infinite wisdom, divine wisdom, God created the world exactly was created because it's in the best interest of that human being in the context of choice, that he makes choices within these parameters. He will be the ultimate beneficiary to be able to have a relationship with God, which is the source of all existence, which is the source of all goodness on the absolute level. So your last question, why? It's not a question. We don't have the answers, But if God created it with limitation in the context that he did, because this is, again, it's not to tell us who he is, but he created something that we should be the greatest beneficiaries. Therefore, it's what? It's with the limits. When an artist paints, or a goldsmith, or a weaver, or any artisan does anything, it's the expressions of his totality. God is not, his totality is not fathomable because he's infinite. Whatever he does is for a specific reason, for a purpose. Why did he create existence in every detail? Under the unlimited components of existence, which they're unlimited, they border on the infinite. It's only because every one of them is that the human being should be the ultimate beneficiary, that this should be the setting for man to make his choices. So therefore, when God revealed and shared with us the various appellations, which have different representations of his being, but not who he is, but rather how he relates. God created this existence. Now, how does he relate to this existence? He relates to this existence within one of 20 ways: indiscriminate kindness, exactness, mercy, various levels of mercy, raining it on his power. And every time he uses one of those appellations, he's revealing to us and sharing with us exactly what's happening at that moment. And he's revealed to us what his capabilities are, not in his essence, but rather how he relates to this limited existence. I always give you the example. You have a physicist who's a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and he has a new child who's 8 months old, and he comes home and he gets down on the floor and he babbles with the little child, with his little newborn son. And people look at him, he's babbling, he's down on the floor, behaving like a person who doesn't have more than a 15 IQ. And people say, what's this man? He's dressed like a fully mature human being, and he babbles like a person who has no intelligence. But you realize, because when you speak to a little baby, that's the way you communicate with a baby. You babble. With this newborn child, you babble. With us, God babbles with us. That's what it's about. He's babbling. Relative to who we are, he's not here to show who he is, only to show who he is regarding to who we are. Within the context of who we are, to appreciate who he is. And that is the concept of every appellation, which is shared with us by the Torah or by the prophets. The words that they use are David in Psalms, the various way he supplicates God, and he uses the various appellations of words. That's all part of it. The Hebrew language, we discussed in the past, is God's language. Every word itself, other languages, how did they come about? It was a consensus of humanity. What do you refer to something which has a horizontal top and has legs on it? What is that called? It can be called a table. It can be called a stool. It can be called a chair. Depends exactly what its function is. But there was a consensus in society how language came about or how it developed. Various things. The Hebrew language is not a language that developed. The Hebrew language is God's language. That means every word, what the word says, that's what the word means. There's an innate meaning in that word. And that word is God's language. Therefore, as I mentioned, the men of the High Assembly, or Jews initially, before we went to exile to Babylon, the Jews spoke a pure Hebrew, which is the Holy Tongue. When we returned from exile, it was no longer as pure. It was a jargon. It had Persian in it, and it had Kazdi in it. It was intermingling of many languages. When you speak to God, it's best to speak in his language, in its purest form, and to know exactly which words are appropriate at the moment and what those words are able to activate and affect when you supplicate God, when you speak his praises, and how they should be said, what the mindset should be. Because as we said, many of the people, there were a few people who were part of this group who authored the Abida, what we call the Shmon Esrei, the Tefillah, they were prophets. So they knew the inner workings of existence and all these energies, and they knew exactly which words are appropriate at the particular moment, which word should precede a word. Although there are many words which have nuances of difference, but basically in the way we express ourselves, they're similar. But when you speak to God in this context, in that audience, and you want to have a response from him at many levels, you have to use a specific word. Because that word is not just a reference, the word means exactly what it says. But we have no idea of the ramifications of the Hebrew language of the words. I give you an example. David says in Psalms, Ki b'kash Shem. With the letters Yud Hey, God created the worlds. The world to come, the spiritual world, was created with the spirituality that lies within the letter Yud. And the physical world was created with the spirituality which lies within the letter Hey. What does that mean? Yud, we know exactly what Yud looks like. We know what a Hey looks like. What if you take an A and a B, or a Y and an H, which is Yud, Hey. What lies in those letters? Nothing lies in it, other than the pronunciation, other than the sound. But in the letters Yud, Hey, or those two letters are stated together, which represents, that's one of the appellations of God, Ko. That is what we call mega power. That is divine power. That power has within it innate ability to create the spiritual world and the physical world. What does this mean? We haven't understand what that means. We have no idea what that means. It's like lahavdil. People say, how did existence come about? The Big Bang Theory. What created the Big Bang? Evidently, there's something which had to be there to create that explosion, the Big Bang. There had to be some level of matter or something. It may have been microscopic or less than that, whatever, but it was something. Ko. The letters Ko are God's language. That's the Hebrew language. That's the holy tongue. There's something innate in the letter Hey and Yud. When you put them together, it creates a spiritual world which borders on the infinite. That's eternity. And the physical world, which is finite. And allows whatever to manifest itself. That every aspect of physicality to address all spiritual potential. And that's why this is the so-called, this is the corridor. This is the playing field where man is tested. And here we take all the initiatives. And based on those initiatives, that will determine what level of share you have in that world to come in eternity. It's very interesting. In this past week's reading, we read about the Paschal Lamb, the 10th plague. The Jews were told that on the 14th of Nisan, which is the month of redemption, they should slaughter the Paschal Lamb, and they should take the blood and put it on the lintel and on the two doorposts. And when God passes over on the 15th at midnight, and he sees the blood of the Jew, he will skip over the houses of the Jews, and he will smite all the firstborn of the Egyptians or non-Jews, when he will see the blood on the lintel and the doorposts. So the Baal HaTurim writes, what is the significance of the blood on the lintel and the doorposts? First, when you put a dab of blood, what does that dab look like? It looks like a yud. That's what it looks like, a dab. A yud is a little tiny letter. It's a dab. So that means you put a yud on the lintel, and you put a yud, something which is symbolically a yud on each of the doorposts. What does this symbolize? So he explains that the first yud on the lintel, what it represents, that's Adam before he ate of the tree of knowledge. Even the physical world was totally coalesced and intertwined in the spiritual world. There was no evil in existence. That's one of the dabs. The second dab represents the Jews at Sinai. When we accepted Torah unequivocally, we rose to a level and we were stated to the level of Adam before the sin of eating of the tree of knowledge. And we would have lived then eternally. the world would have achieved its level of perfection. But because we participated in the sin of the golden calf, we reverted back to post-sin. That's what the second dab represents. The third dab represents, at the end of time, where all evil will be purged from existence, and when God we recognized as the supreme master of all existence, there'll be no distractions, because there's not going to be a trace of evil in existence. That's the third dab. So those three dabs represent the letter Yud. That means, what is the letter Yud? What is innately lies in that letter? Spirit, the spiritual world. So do we have an understanding of the symbolisms of the Hebrew alphabet? What lies in each one of those letters? We have no idea. Tzalel, the nephew of Moshe, who was the grandson of Miriam, he oversaw the building of the Mishkan. After the sin of the golden calf, God said, make for me a Mishkan, a sanctuary, so I should dwell in your midst. That will be the intermediate, that's the medium through which I could dwell in your midst. The Mishkan. Betzalel was chosen to oversee the building of this Mishkan. Was the Mishkan just a physical edifice? It was much more than a physical edifice. The Mishkan itself, every detail, its specifications, its vessels, the beams, the vertical, everything was infused with a specific intent. What intent was the Mishkan infused with? So the Talmud tells us, first the Torah tells us, he was endowed with divine inspiration, insight, knowledge, which no one else had. And that's why he was the one who oversaw the building of Mishkan, because every aspect of Mishkan had to be infused with a specific intent. And that intent will give the Mishkan the capacity to allow God's presence to dwell in it. And therefore, the Mishkan took on the status of a microcosm of existence. As we discussed, that just as existence came about in 6 days and God rested on the seventh day, and the energies which brought about existence were spiritual energy. They weren't physical acts. But the Jew, being the chosen people of God, are a testament to the world that God created the world in 6 days and refrained on the seventh day and rested on the seventh day. So what don't we do on the seventh day? We don't engage in the 39 creative activities. And where are these activities learned from, derived from? It's derived from the building of the Mishkan. What does the Mishkan have to do with creation? The Torah juxtaposes the provision of doing creative activity on Shabbos with the building of the Mishkan, meaning that those spiritual energies which brought about existence in the physical sense, these physical creative activities are representatives of those spiritual energies. Because what did those physical actions do? It created a domicile, which is the equivalent of the existence of the world. Because the original intent of creation is, where was God supposed to dwell? On the terrestrial level, with mankind. But because Adam ate of the tree of knowledge and he putrefied the terrestrial level, God ascended from that terrestrial level. It wasn't appropriate any longer for God to be there. At Sinai, God came to the terrestrial level, because the Jews achieved that special level of spiritual perfection. But again, we putrefied it by engaging the golden calf. So God says, now make for me a domicile on the terrestrial level, which is equivalent of the existence pre-sin of Adam. So that was a new creation of existence. The Mishkan was a microcosm of existence. So the Talmud tells us, he knew how to conjugate the letters, the Hebrew letters through which God created existence. because he had that inner knowledge. He was privy to it because God had endowed him with that knowledge. Therefore, he was able to replicate in the Mishkan to be the microcosm of all existence. So again, what do we talk about? It's letters. He understood how to conjugate letters to bring about the equivalent of what all existence is about, which is known as the Mishkan. Although it's, relatively speaking, it's a tiny little location. But symbolically, because it was infused with all the intent, which is the equivalent of the energies which brought about existence, therefore it has a capacity for God's presence to dwell there. That's the concept. So what are Hebrew letters? What is the Hebrew language? What is the Hebrew alphabet? Hebrew alphabet is just not a way to pronounce words as every other language. Man was endowed with speech, but what languages do they speak? What does the language, what they represent? Purely communication. The Hebrew language, it's not only communication, but there's something innate in the language that when we speak the language, the letters have a representation which activate forces, unlimited spiritual forces, which impact on the physical existence and impact on eternity. We study Torah. There's a mitzvah not only to meditate in Torah, but a person is supposed to articulate the words. It's not enough just to understand the concepts and the laws behavioral-wise, but once studies Torah, he's supposed to articulate the words, pronounce the words. The Talmud tells a story. Rameir had a wife, very special woman. Her name was Bruria. Bruria was the daughter of one of the 10 martyrs who were murdered by the Romans. His name was Reb Hanania ben Trajan. He was wrapped in Torah and burnt alive. She was his daughter. She was the wife of Rameir, the famous Rameir of the Talmud, Rameir Baal HaNes. That was his wife. And she was a tremendous Torah sage with a father like who she had. And her husband, Rameir, she was like a Torah sage, except she was a woman. And she's walking, and one of Rameir's students is studying. And he's studying without verbalizing what he's studying, doesn't articulate the words. So she says to him, do you realize you're just wasting your time? Because the pasuk says, the verse says, Chaim heim lamotzi'ehem. Literally means studying Torah brings life to one who comes upon it. So she said to him, but the interpretation is, it gives life lamotzi'ehem, the one who articulates it, the one who verbalizes it. That's what it brings life. You have to articulate the words. By articulating those words, you actually activate certain levels of holiness, of these spiritual forces, and God responds to it. When you articulate the words of Torah itself. The Torah is God's knowledge, and the words that were given to us, as they are, innately, they contain this mega energy. They're able to activate unlimited forces. And that's what she said to him. So when the men of the High Assembly, they authored what we call the Abidah, the Tefillah, the Shemona Esrei, every letter, not only are they Hebrew letters, not only the Hebrew words, which the words are God's language. These words are God's language, but the conjugation of those words, the order, the choice of words, in the context, together with all the prerequisites which you have to meet, it brings about a result, which we don't even fathom what that is. To us, saying words, whether you say it in the English language, the French language, Russian, whatever it is, it's all the same. It's not the same. It was authored, and as the Rambam says, because the Jews no longer spoke that pure Hebrew, it was a jargon, they had to author it in the Hebrew. So now understanding that, if a person has a choice to pray in Hebrew, where you have a semblance of understanding what those words mean, or pray in any other language, of course, the law is, the definitive law is you could pray in any language. and one fulfills his obligation of prayer. But in terms of value and effect and response, there's no comparison. At any level, there's no comparison. Because not only are you praying to God on the very superficial level, understanding what you're saying, the words we use, because of the words that were chosen, which innately contain that mega energy, because they're spiritual words, it's the Hebrew alphabet. But knowing that you're speaking to God using his words, you actually, it's not to be understood what we activate or we bring about. The Talmud tells us that Hillel, the sage, who was the prince of Israel, he had 80 students. The greatest of his students, his name was Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. We have an Aramaic translation of the Torah. It's called Targum Yonasan ben Uziel. And then we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Yochanan ben Zakkai was what? Was the prince of Israel at the time of destruction of the Second Temple. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was from the least of his students. So the Talmud asks, if you'd want to identify what was the difference between them, Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel was the greatest, and is one knew more than the other? Or says no. Knowledge-wise, what one knew, the other knew. And it goes to God to go to delineate what they knew. You know, they knew everything there is to know. But not only that, they knew sichas de kolim. When the trees, their leaves rustle in the wind, those sounds, their energies being communicated. They could read those sounds, they could decipher those sounds. Sichas tziporim, the language of birds, or birds chirp, although they're unintelligible creatures, but they are communicating something about existence. Chirping of birds, they understood that language. There's nothing they didn't understand. So basically, each of them had the same level of knowledge. What does it mean? This was the greatest, and this was from the lesser students. So the Talmud says, when Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel would study Torah, if there were birds flying overhead, they'd be consumed with fire. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai studied that same Torah, they would not be consumed by fire. What does that mean? It means that in terms of the dimension of person who is studying them, the words are what they are. But in terms of the dimension of the soul of that person, it's a different dimension of person. Therefore, it generates a whole different reality of holiness. Therefore, the birds that flew overhead while we studied were consumed by fire. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Torah is the same Torah. But because the dimension of the person is not the same, the effect is no longer the same. I'll give you the example. A person that has a shot put, and the person is phenomenally strong. And the shot put has a certain degree of weight. Based on the velocity of you throw it, that's how far it's going. So based on the power of the person, the Torah itself innately is something which is infinite. This infinite body of words, which have contained with it an infinite ability, potential to bring about, to turn worlds, create worlds that we can't even fathom what they are. Now, who's activating those energies? What is the dimension of that person? The Torah innately is what it is. What it's being infused with, each of them is infusing with the same thing. But what's the dimension of the person? It's like, you have booster rockets that shoot the Challenger out of the atmosphere of the Earth. You need a booster rocket to activate it, to shoot it beyond that. What is the booster rocket? Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel had a certain power. That power was his soul, the dimension of his soul. The Torah is the same Torah. But when it emanates from such a soul, anything within its proximity gets burnt up, gets consumed by fire. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was not that. This just to give you an understanding of why it was necessary to have prophets, 3 prophets, the last 3 living prophets, because after they passed away, there was no longer prophecy. They were part of this body of Torah sages who compiled the words for the Amidah. And this is our text till the end of time. When we supplicate God with that mindset, you say those words, it activates those forces, as long as you meet that criteria. The Chavetz Chaim, in his commentary on Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Laws, cites from the Kabbalists that when one says the Amidah, one does not have to have any more intention than just knowing what the words mean, and you stand before God. And he cites that the great Kabbalists, they would pray like a child before a father. That's it. You don't need more than that. Everything's contained within those words. The only reason why we need the additional intentions and whatever may be, that's only to keep focus, because otherwise our minds or our emotion wouldn't be in the right place. We need all these aids, Kabbalistic insights. You only need that to keep focused. But in terms of the innate value of what's accomplished, if you're able to keep the focus without it, it has no less value, because everything is contained within those words. I always give the example. We don't know, but we know that the Trident missiles under the ocean throughout the world, and there's code red, that there's a keyboard that if you hit any of those keys on which activate those missiles are going to go off, and they're aimed at certain locations in the world, certain centers of humanity. And if that missile hits, that city is destroyed. Millions of people could be killed. Person has that keyboard, all he knows how to identify letters, but he doesn't even know what the significance of that keyboard is. And he starts touching those keys, pressing those keys. He does not even understand what's happening. Every time he touches a key, it activates a missile. And that missile has power that we can't even relate to the amount of power that lies within that missile. Lahavdil, we say words, I understand Hebrew well because I took an ulpan. I took 5 lessons in the holy tongue, but I don't speak with a forked tongue, the holy tongue, but you don't understand. It's not that you understand the Hebrew. There's these words and other words. These words have very specific, special significance. This goes beyond touching the key that activates a Trident missile. This activates forces that all existence is impacted and functions because of these words. The Talmud in Brachos quotes a pasuk, Krum zulas l'bnei Adam, that there's something which the world stands on this, and mankind belittles and does not value sufficiently. What is that? It's tefillah. Tefillah, junior congregation. You remember when you were a little boy, junior congregation, you went, and you sang the tune. It's not that. And unfortunately, the level of understanding of value as an adult hasn't increased much since you were a child. It's something we do as Jews. It's something more than what we do as Jews. The world stands on that. Even tefillah, as I said, according to Nachmanides, may not be an obligation, but it has infinite value, because if you do pray, it does have that special value, that it touches upon every echelon of existence. Based on a verse, the Talmud tells us that anything that's measured, weighed, or counted is not subject to bracha. If it's been measured, weighed, or counted, it's not subject to blessing. So therefore, the Talmud says, a person brings in his harvest, and he has unlimited bushels of wheat, and he hasn't yet evaluated what what the harvest is all about. Has weighed the wheat, he hasn't counted the bushels, and he supplicates Hashem and says, "It should be the will of God that blessing should come upon my harvest." It's a valid supplication. Why? Because when he prayed, since it wasn't yet evaluated, he had no idea the extent of what the harvest was. It's something which is unknown. Unknown quantity, blessing comes upon. But if he already had evaluated, he measured it, he weighed it, he knows exactly how many bushels he has, and he says, "Let it be the will of God that blessing should come upon my harvest," it's a supplication in vain. So the Talmud asks why? Because blessing only comes upon something that's concealed from the eye. Once it's already quantified, it has no relevance to blessing. So the Maharal of Prague explains what is the concept. He says the concept of blessing, what we call bracha, is a spiritual concept. In the spiritual realm is not finite. We speak eternity, it's forever. Even though relative to infinite, it's not infinite, because only God is infinite, but it's something which is unlimited. It cannot be quantified. So if blessing is a spiritual concept, once you quantify something, so it already takes on a physical identity. It takes on a physical characteristic. Once it takes on that physical characteristic, because it's been quantified, it no longer has relevance to blessing, because blessing is a spiritual concept. So therefore, pre-quantification, before you count it, before you measure it, before you weigh it, it's an unknown entity. Unknown, it has relevance to what? To the spiritual. Therefore, bracha, blessing, has relevance to it. Therefore, the supplication for blessing has value. Once you quantify it and know exactly the degree of value, a number of bushels, if now you want to take something which is physical and impact it with something which is spiritual, it's a different realm of existence. It has no relevance to it. Therefore, it's a supplication in vain. That's how the Maharal of Prague explains the Gemara. So I ask the question. We're not too far off. We speak about the building of the Mishkan. In terms of its materials, in terms of its dimension, in terms of its specifications, it was so exact. There's almost nothing compared to the exactness. And if it wasn't built according to specification, it wasn't valid. Whether it's the altar, it's the table, it's the Oro, the ark. And yet, God says, make for me a Mishkan, so I should dwell in your midst. God, being the infinite being, has relevance to a location that's so specific and so quantified that everything has to be to specification to the nth degree. Seemingly, and all blessing emanates from the Mishkan. So how does blessing emanate from a location where everything is so finite? Seems to be contradictory to this concept that we're speaking about. That's a question I asked. So what I answered, it really has to do similar to Tefillah. As we say, Yud K, Yud Hey, God created physical, spiritual worlds. There's something innate. Do we have any understanding what it is? It's all concealed. We have no idea. It's not fathomable. Once it's, even though we know what a Yud looks like and a Hey looks like, and we know how to pronounce it, do we have any understanding what innately lies in those letters? And what energies it activates? We have no idea. As a result of that, it's concealed. And because it is concealed, it has realms to the spiritual realm. The Mishkan, every aspect of Mishkan, its specifications, these are all symbolisms. We have no idea. Do we know why it had to be so many cubits and so much this or so much that, or this material, not another kind of material? We have no idea. Gold is a symbolism. Copper is a symbolism. Silver is a symbol. Everything is symbolically represents something in the spiritual realm. So in terms of grasping or have any inkling of what is, we have no idea. Therefore, God, the infinite being, he's the one who dictated all aspects of the Mishkan, how it has to be built, what the materials are, and the specifications are. And he says, then if you meet those specifications, that is my domicile. I will dwell in your midst. That will be my medium. The Talmud tells us, the Talmud tells us that God's signet is truth. God's signet is truth. And I always say from the Maral, in the Hebrew language, when you want to have a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which represents something which is infinitesimal, the Aleph represents that, something which is an iota. Now, if a person says truth, and it's only 99.9999% truthful, what is it? It's not truth. How do we know it's not truth? But it's almost unadulterated truth. Because if you take the aleph off the word emes, what's left? Mem tov, mes. Mes is a corpse, has no value. Not only that, it generates an impurity. It has to be unadulterated truth. That's what it has to be. So the Talmud tells us you have a Torah sage. He studied the Talmud. And somebody says to him, I heard you're proficient in the whole Talmud. So it says he's permitted to alter the truth and say it's not true. What they say about me is not true. They say I know so much, it's not true. It's exaggerated. But the person who's responding by saying this is not saying the truth. The Talmud doesn't say he's permitted to lie. Lie means saying something that you're not permitted to say. The Talmud refers to this as altering the truth. Why you're permitted? So the commentators explain for the sake of humility, you're permitted. Therefore, it's called altering the truth, not lying. Because a Jew is supposed to be humble. So by saying it's not as you say it, and you say it's exaggerated, that's humility, that you're permitted. However, I was thinking, what is Torah? Torah itself is not quantifiable. Even when we study, in terms of the knowledge is only a representation of unlimited, infinite, the infinite. If you put a number to it, what are you doing? You're quantifying the spiritual. The moment you quantify, say, I know so much, automatically, you've already put limitation on it, that its value is no longer within the spiritual realm. Therefore, you're permitted to say, it's not what you say. The number you're putting on is not the right number. Excuse me. That's why a person's permitted. He's permitted to alter the truth. Because by altering the truth, not saying what it is, even the person who knows what he knows. But even if I know what I know, I don't know the innate significance of what I know. We have no inkling of what it is. I'll give you an example. A person has a key, and the key looks like many other keys. But this key, when you turn it, it can activate unlimited forces that the world goes to another level. You know you have a key. It's called a key, but you don't understand what that key is. But if you say, well, this key is no different than any other key, you're totally off. It's a misrepresentation of what that is. You say, I have Torah. I know so much. As I say, by putting a number to it, you're putting it in a context of it's limited to that, but it's not limited to that. You have no inkling what lies within that knowledge. Therefore, you say, it's not what you say. It's not what they say about me is exaggerated. It's not true. It's not who I am. They must be speaking about someone else. But it's based on that concept. The tefillah itself, the words that were chosen by the men of the High Assembly, a number of them were prophets. These 19 blessings, the words that are contained within them, and the laws which pertain to them, we're talking about this represents all existence. All existence is fueled, the energies that are activated because of the Hebrew words, the letters, the language, the choice of words, the conjugation of those words. We have no idea what it is, but it does lie within that. It lies within those words and understanding it. It's like almost humility. You have the privilege not only to have an audience with God, but you're speaking words which are not finite words. You're speaking to the infinite being. And what language are you speaking to him? Not just Hebrew, which is his language. It's a language which the words that were chosen to speak, you have no idea, you cannot fathom what lies within those words. Rav Chaim Volozhin writes in his work, Nefesh HaChaim, that all the writings of the Arizal, who was the great Kabbalist, 16th century Kabbalist, is less than a tipa shabiyam. It's less than a drop in the ocean compared to what lies within those words. If you know all the writings of the Arizal, you're one of the greatest Kabbalists who ever lived. But it still doesn't come to what's written, to the innate value of the Amida. What lies in there, you know what that is? So what is it? It's unquantifiable. But it's words. It has so many letters and so many words, and you can say it by heart. It means nothing, but that's not what it is. And if you think that's what it is, then you're quantifying something which is not. I think we're going to stop recording at this moment. Here's the question again.
So, Rabbi, in your last comment in this lecture, in this shir, you mentioned the notion of quantifying something that isn't quantifiable, specifically to the comment of how we addressed or looked at the Amida. Can you comment on that?
Yes. What I said was, if I would explain to you the specification of the Mishkan, I'm not quantifying the Mishkan. It's not quantification. Because we said it's all symbolisms. And what it represents the infinite. Therefore, that's not called quantification. When you bring in your harvest and you have 1,000 bushels of wheat, what are 1,000 bushels of wheat? 1,000 bushels. So that is a true quantification of what the harvest is. So that's finite. Before it's quantified, it has an aspect of unknown, which has relevance to spiritual. Once you quantify it, now finally, you've actually fully encased it in its reality of what it is, physical. The Mishkan, as much as we speak about its specifications, its materials, and its makeup, we don't even have an inkling of what that is. So that's not called the quantification of reality. The language we speak to God, the Hebrew language, Hebrew specifically, every letter represents something which has mega energy in it. We have no idea what those letters, what they contain. And especially with the conjugation of the letters and the words that were chosen by the men of the High Assembly, the forces they activate, as much as we think we know what we're saying, although we only understand on a superficial level, because we speak to the infinite being, which is God himself, the language we speak is an unquantified language because what it contains is unquantifiable. That's what I said. So as much as we think, although it's limited to 19 blessings, and you could say the words, all you're doing is repeating something which we have no understanding other than at the most superficial level what the words mean. We understand the meaning of the words when we speak to God, but what's contained within those words, we have no idea. It's unfathomable. That's what I mentioned, that all the writings of the Arizal are less than a drop in the ocean compared to what's contained within those words.
Thank you, Rabbi.